Today we are going to be looking at roots of numbers, and we have different types of roots. In the past we've always looked at square roots, and that is one type of root. And we'll give you some terminology that goes along with these square roots. So let me give you a square root here. There's our sign. And it's not considered a square root symbol. Oftentimes people will call it that, but it actually has another name. It's called a radical. A radical sign is what that's referred to, because there are other roots rather than just a square root, and we'll see that today. The number underneath the radical sign has a certain name as well, and that's called a radicand. And then we have the answer as well. And so let's see if we can figure out what the square root of 4 is. What we're looking for are two numbers that multiply to make 4, and they have to be the same number. And so it's like undoing an exponent. And actually a square root, or any type of root, can be written as an exponent. We'll learn that later on. Well, what two numbers multiply to make 4? Well, that's just 2. So the square root of 4 is 2. But inside square roots, we also have other types. We've got a principal square root, which is what we have right here. This is, like for instance, the square root of 9. It's considered a principal square root because it's a positive number. We have no sign in front of the radical sign, so we call that a principal square root. And the two numbers that multiply to make 9? Well, we're 3 and 3, so the principal square root is just 3. So the square root is just looking for what number it is that multiplies to make the value underneath the radical sign. By itself, the number of times, in this case 2 times. A negative square root, well, that would just mean that we have a minus sign on the outside of the radical sign. So it's like the opposite of. And so this refers to, again, that opposite. Opposite of the square root of whatever number I decide to put in here. So let's try 49 this time. So the opposite of the square root of 49. And the opposite of that is just going to be negative 7. So it's kind of like this. It's like taking the square root, which is 7. The square root of 49 is 7. But then just naming the opposite of that. This minus sign could be considered like this. Negative 1 times by the square root of 49. And since I said before the square root symbols we can consider as exponents. We do exponents before multiplication, so that's why this answer is going to be negative 7. So that's a square root. A cubic root just means that we're looking now for 3 numbers, 3 roots, 3 numbers that multiply to make the value. And so they show that symbolization by drawing an index. And so, as I said before, this radical sign is the symbol for the root symbol, and then we have the number underneath, the radicand, and then we have a number, like let's say I say 27. And so here I'm looking for 3 numbers. This index tells me that I'm looking now for 3 numbers, a cubic root. So 3 numbers that have to be the same that multiply to make 27. Well, if you try 3 times 3 times 3, those 3 3's, 2 3's make 9, one more 3 multiplied by the 9 makes 27. So the answer is 3. There we have it. Well, taking a look at another one, a higher root. And so let's do a 4th root this time. Let's do the 4th root of, let's say, 16. And so one rule about these is that if it's an odd number underneath the radical sign, we're going to get an odd number. If it's an even number, like here 16, we're going to get an even number. So that cuts the numbers by half. And so what we need to do now is find out 4 numbers that multiply to make 16. They have to be even because they multiply to make an even number. Well, if I try some numbers like 2, let's see if I multiply 4 2's together, I get 16. So that's the number. So 2 is the answer. So again, the number in the index, just a small little number, a small number in the upper left-hand corner of that radical sign, tells you the number of roots we're looking for. So our directions are going to say find each root. Well, if you don't see an index, then we take this as a square root. So the 2 numbers that make 64, well, that would just be 8. And that would be your number here. Here we're looking for the negative square root, so it's going to be a negative. And then we have an odd number, and it's a square root because we don't see an index here. And 2 numbers that make 225, well, 15 and 15. So you just got to keep on trying them until it works. One thing I do know is I know it was less than 20. I know it wasn't 20 because 20 is even, but 20 times 20 is 400. 10 times 10 is 100, so I knew it was in between there. Well, here we're looking for three numbers that multiply to make a negative 64. Well, that means we're looking for some negatives. So like, well, 3 wouldn't work because that's an odd number, but if I try the next number higher, 4. See, negative 4 times negative 4 makes 16, times by one more negative 4 makes negative 64. And so there it is. The answer is negative 4 is what we're looking for. So you can have a negative number underneath the radical sign, but you got to have an odd x or odd index here in order to make that work. Four numbers that make 625, you know it's an odd number, so you just try some different odd numbers. And 5 times 5 makes 25, times another 5 makes 125, times one more makes 625. And so that would be our answer, just 5. Well, here we have a fraction underneath the radical sign. Well, one of the rules is you can break it into separate radicals. And so I can break this into like the square root of 1, which is just 1. The square root of 16 is 4. So that is my answer, 1/4. So you do the same thing if it's a cubic root. You can just take the cubic root of 8 and then take the cubic root of 27. And so notice that three numbers that make 8, well, it has to be even because 8's an even number. And so if you try 2 times 2 times 2, that does make 8. Three numbers that make 27, well, we did that already. That is 3, so 2/3 is the answer. If you have a decimal, all you're going to do is try some numbers. Just look at the number and try getting that, and then worry about the decimal. So what number makes 1? Well, 1 times 1 times 1. What makes a negative 1? Well, they all have to be negative. Well, but I need the decimal to move over 3 spaces. Well, I'm multiplying 3 numbers, and it has to move over 3 spaces. So let's put the decimal point right after the 1 here. You see, if I put it right here, that will move it over 1, 2, 3 spaces. So try to figure out the number first. Figure out the 1 here, and then try to figure out the decimals. I'll give you another example of that. So this one in this case is negative 1/10. Let's try another one like that. Let me write one up here. Let's go with the square root of, how about 81? 81 hundredths. So try to get the 81 first. Two numbers that make 81. Well, 9 times 9 makes 81. Now try to figure out how many spaces to move the decimal. Well, just 2, so that means I need 2 spaces over. So that is just 9/10. So that's what we're doing there. And let's take a look at another type of problem that we'll see. It says estimate roots. So Ed has a 19 square foot garden. Estimate the nearest tenth the side length of the garden. So it's a square garden. So it looks like this. But we're trying to find two numbers that multiply to make 19. We don't know what those numbers are. So we want to find out what the side length is going to end up being. So if I took the square root of 19, that's what I'm looking for. But I'm not sure what the square root of 19 is. So what you can do to figure out a good estimate would be to find the perfect squares in between. Well, I know the square root of 25 is going to end up being 5, and that's bigger than 19. But let me find the one that's smaller. Square root of 16 is smaller, and that is 4. So I know it's in between 4 and 5. Now let's figure out which one it's closer to. Because it could be like, it's not going to be necessarily 4.5, but it could be closer to one than the other. And so what you do to find out which one it's closer to is subtract. Subtract the radicands. So 19 minus 16 makes only 3, where if I take away 19 from 25, I end up with 6. So it's definitely closer to the 4. So I'm going to try numbers like 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, those types of numbers, or maybe even 4.4. And since it's pretty close to, I would probably go with either a 4.3 or 4.4. I'm going to try 4.4. But let's go ahead and just see what that ends up being. If we go ahead and punch it into the calculator, if I do that, 19, and I take the square root of that, I ended up with this. Approximately, it was about 4.35, and then it kept on going. So I thought it was in between 4.3 and 4.4, but I figured maybe a little bit closer to 4.4, so that's what I went with. So that's how I got the answer. So 4.4 feet is what we ended up coming up with. So that's the way to approximate. It's just put the number that you have in the center, find the square roots that are on either side, and then you've got where it's in between. Figure out which one it's closer to, and then just approximate what that would be. Evaluate each expression. Evaluate means substitute. Take that 9 and put that in for all the a's. So we're going to put in for this a here and this a down here. And then take that 7, put that in for the b, and see what you get. So we got 9 times, now that 8, the a this time is not an index. It's being multiplied. It's right next to. It's not up in the corner. So 9 times by, and then 9 plus 7. And so we go ahead and add those numbers underneath the radical sign first, because you got to do the work underneath the radical sign before you take the square root. So we add that, and we end up with 16. Now you can take the square root. So we got to do the square root symbol first, because that's just like an exponent. Actually, it is an exponent. We'll see that later on in the course. And that makes 36 as the answer once we go ahead and do the work. Here we definitely have a fourth root. So we go ahead and substitute those numbers in there. 7 in for b, then 9 in for a, and then we add, and then we have a, which is 9, times by b, which is 7. And so we do some work there. Fourth root of 16 plus, and then 9 times 7, we go ahead and do that work, makes 63. Well, fourth root of 16, we saw that earlier in this lesson, and that is 2. 4 numbers that make 16, right up here. 2, 2, 2, and 2 make 16. So 2 plus 63 gives me 65 as the answer. And so those are the types of problems that you're going to end up seeing on tonight's homework. Good luck.